Well, for sure they will. Already they've changed demonstrably over history. Structures of feeling, Raymond Williams calls these, so that biochemically we're the same animals that we were for the last 150,000 years. But in terms of culturally structuring these biochemical feelings, we have different names for them, or even if the names are even the same, we have organized them differently to channel our feelings into acceptable thoughts and into speech acts and into actions in the world. So that a concept like love has gone through courtly love in the early Middle Ages, or arranged marriage love, or romantic love as the Romantic movement, or postmodern love as an affect state rather than an actual feeling, a decentered affect state that has to do more with bodily sensations. So that definitions of these terms and the feelings themselves, in other words, what's normal, has already is constantly fluid and changing. Culture changes, and then therefore we change in our thinking, but mostly not in our biochemistry. Not so far. Well, there's always a kind of generational story that we tell, at least in this culture, where we kind of parse it down to many generations of every 10 years or so because of the numerical, the 10 fingers, the 10 years. It's fairly biological still, where we'll say that each generation is different from the parent generation and have some similarities to the kind of leap to the grandparents. There are more similarities. So it kind of back and forth in attitudes towards certain things. So young generation, there's this talk of being able to pay attention to more than one thing at once. A kind of rapid taking in of information from playing video games and spending a lot of time on the internet, which is challengeable, but at least it's a feeling or an affect state that I want a lot of stimulation. I can take a lot of stimulation and take it all in. It changes from generation to generation. So as you get more openness about the effect of drugs on the brain, and you get more complicated and more specific drugs, it could be that you get generations that are more disjunct from their parental generation than usual, but it's usually a pretty big divide anyway. So it'll be more of that, and maybe more accentuated. There is one divide, though. There's a great short story by Robert Silverberg, and it comes up from thinking about Aubrey de Grey. This story is called Gate of Ivory, Gate of Horn. And there's a generation where they can see that the younger ones will have passed into this longevity escape velocity. Essentially, the younger generation is going to be clearly living for hundreds of years, but the people who are old are too old to get the benefits of the treatment. That would be a really severe generational divide, because there would be one generation saying goodbye to a generation that was going to be living a really long time. Well, that's a funny question, because optimism is a couple of different things. It's one of these feeling states. In a structure of feeling, in our structure of feeling, to be called optimistic is often contains an implied critique that says you must be a little simple-minded, given how grave our problems are, that you would still be optimistic as either a biochemical state where you're just lofted by your biochemistry into permanent chilferness, or else you might be a little dim-witted and you don't see the nature of the problems. So I would say that maybe I fit all these categories of optimism, but it's also a willed political stance, which is to say that, especially if you're in the prosperous Western countries, to go about being pessimistic and negative is not to even take cognizance of your own privilege and how good you have it compared to many of the people alive today, so that it looks a little bit whiny and unuseful to be pessimistic and negative, and that optimism is a political stance, optimism of the will, as Gramsci put it. You say, look, the future could be better, and these are the things we can do in the present to make the future better for our children. And so you're optimistic by policy, not just by reading off the situation. Now, the situation right now is real grim. We do have a planet that is being hammered by our impacts on it and is likely to change its climate quite significantly, which may lead to a mass extinction event. So you have to context that first. You have to say that, and then say, we have the chance to make that situation better. We have a chance to reduce the number of extinctions to something less than a mass extinction event. It becomes a question of, well, how much do we save for the generations to come who don't have any say right now? If you're a science fiction writer, you're speaking for the future. You say, well, for all these generations to come, what we need to do right now is assume that things that we do matter and can make it better, and do what we can. And then if that's optimism, then that's what I'm advocating. I hope that we get a stable population where all the human beings on the planet have adequacy and are able to make themselves more like they were than ever before, and that all of the big mammals on the planet are equally given lives of their own, which means a certain amount of wilderness area, which is going to be a certain kind of park. Wilderness is now a thing that we allow to exist because we could destroy it. So I hope for a world where human civilization stabilizes in its numbers, gets really clean tech, balances with the natural world, and then goes out to the other planets in the solar system, begins to explore further possibilities for themselves. And so, yeah, I think that's a perfectly good thing to hope for. Well, I think we have to talk about it, and we have to admit that capitalism is a successor system, economic system to feudalism, that's not interested in sustainability or in justice. It's interested in the feudal issues of power, hierarchy, control, and a sense of scarcity, such that the notion being that only the aristocracy can live well in a productive system that produces what it does, and only by immiserating a certain amount of the population that is making the goods that the aristocracy lives off of. Well, that's been hypertrophied in our system, and the basis of power in land has gone over to a basis of power in money, so it's been liquidified, but there's still a hierarchy that is feudal in its gradient from the people who have the most to the people who have the least. So once we admit that that problem exists, begin to try to remediate capitalism, there will be massive resistance to that. There'll be a kind of a period of instability as humans try to decide what they care about more, the economic system that they're in or the physical world that they're in. And I think it's going to come down to the physical world that they're in, and that the shudderings and the shock and dislike and aversion to change in our economic system is misplaced and maybe is weak compared to our desire to have a decent world for our kids. So this is another thing that I hope for. Well, I'm frightened about precisely capitalism not changing fast enough, that we don't change our economic system fast enough, and that we crash the system on the planet and we get into a couple bad things, a mass extinction event or food shortages, which would precipitate mass panics amongst human beings, and we will not behave well in a panic mode. So these are things that I fear greatly, that without noticing it, we degrade the planet. Like, say, ocean acidification, which is one obvious result of us burning so much carbon. The CO2 goes up in the air, and then a lot of it ends up in the ocean. We get a more acid ocean. If that killed off the bottom of the food chain, these little things that have calcium shells, and then everything in the ocean died, suddenly like 1/3 of human foods is gone. And at that point we have a panic, and at that point we have some kind of horrible crash. And I'm not a crash person. I don't believe in apocalypse. I don't believe a crash is imminent. But I do fear that we could accidentally slip over a slippery slope to where it would become very hard to recover. And that's my main fear. So it's worth talking about now, because we're sort of in the beginning of it.